Welcome back, folks. We're going to start moving into Chapter 4 with this lecture. Explanations of gender continued on. In this particular section, we'll be looking at psychoanalytic and development perspectives on gender. This takes us into Freud, feminism, and the male-female tests that were constructed in the mid-1930s. Essentially, we're looking at science starting to make its statements on gender in the early 20th century. Following along this particular road, that anatomy is not destiny. We have to keep in mind that cultural influences, our culture influences our personalities, behaviors, and beliefs. And that is deeply influenced by our life experiences from intimacy onward. It's our life experiences that deliver the culture that our societies value and the norms that have been constructed to define who we ultimately become. Freud is certainly aware of cultural impacts, and he believed our interactions with family were the most crucial in shaping our gender and our gender identity. A couple of important concepts to think about in reference to Freud. The id, which is kind of your emotional state, all of the things that you desire, and ultimately cannot have because we live in a social landscape, but you still desire them, and so those desires need to be fulfilled from early on, from our birthing process. And so the ego is kind of the rational side of identity development, and the ego is essentially what tries to tame, keep under control all of these desires, these unfulfilled desires of the id. And then there's the superego, which is in many respects the culture within which these individual identities are formed, and it's a larger representation, kind of like a generalized other that helps control the id desires of the individuals. So thinking about that, you have to, to understand Freud, you need to think about his ideas on the id, the ego, and the superego. And he also talks about how the individual passes through a number of stages on a path to an adult gender identity. The first phase is that oral phase, which is pleasure seeking through food. When the child leaves the womb, it leaves essentially this Eden where all of its desires are fulfilled for it. And so the first phase of identity development is this oral pleasure seeking, which we find through the mother's breast. Then we are ultimately weaned away from that as the ego starts to control that pleasure. The next one is anal, the pleasure of bodily functions. We can relieve ourselves at any time we feel like doing it. We gain pleasure from it, and then ultimately, as we grow up, we're potty trained, and the ego begins to control those functions as well, those pleasures. And then the final one is that genital phase, that phallic phase, and this is really where gender identity is formed. Um, the Freud talks about this in reference to an Oedipal crisis, and where the male has to break away from the mother, and then penis envy that women experience because they don't have a penis like males do. As I said, this edible complex that Freud was describing, essentially boys must detach from their mother and identify with the father if they are to fully embrace their masculinity. There's a problem for boys if the mother is an affectionate caregiver and that father is remote. It can create that Oedipal crisis where a boy desires the mother but realizes that he is competing with his father. Once he realizes that he is in competition with his father for his mother's love, a transformation happens and he ceases to be feminine and becomes ultimately masculine. Girls, on the other hand, learn to identify with the mother, and therefore they experience penis envy because realizing that the only way to maintain identification with the mother is to be possessed by a man. Therefore, they long to engage with the penis and what Freud would call penis envy. And as that happens, girls move away from sexual gratification through stimulation of the clitoris to something more similar to your typical intercourse in an effort to impregnate, which is a much more passive sexuality of vaginal penetration. So Freud is removing gender from biology. He's saying it's a psychological achievement that happens within the family. It's this uh, passing on of cultural traits from your society through the family that ultimately define the gender characteristics of males and females. Freud links to gender identity to sexual orientation. This ultimately makes homosexuality an issue of gender, not an issue of morality. And ultimately, Freud wasn't he wasn't opposed. He didn't find homosexuality to be abhorrent. He felt homosexuality happened when something in this development process failed. So somewhere along in the gender identity phase, the gender formation phase, the process failed, ultimately resulting in homosexual behavior. And of course, Freud reinforces stereotypes of the time where boys initiate sex and they're the aggressors and girls are more passive.